what does it really take to become a therapist? And think about the trust, right? The trust we place in people who are supposed to guide us through our most vulnerable moments. Today, we're taking a deep dive into a story that's, frankly, profoundly unsettling. It really makes you question that trust. We're focusing on the experiences of Naomi Best. She's a 26-year-old graduate student, was pursuing her therapy degree at Santa Clara University. Her story, which came out in a Wall Street Journal article, details what she calls institutionalized sexual harassment and ideological indoctrination. And this is within a program that's meant to train compassionate mental health professionals. So our mission here is to unpack these really eyebrow-raising course requirements she faced, how the university responded or didn't respond, and what this all means. The implications for psychology and maybe more importantly for future patients.
Exactly. And it's more than just one person's story, as, powerful as Naomi's account is. It's a really stark look at how a specific worldview, when it gets embedded in professional training, can, well, profoundly shape things, potentially even warp the kind of care people receive. We're going to try and connect the dots here, look at the actual course content, the specific things she was asked to do, and link that to the theoretical framework Naomi believes is driving it all, to really get under the hood, see what's going on.
Okay, so let's start with Naomi. Who is she? How did she end up at Santa Clara?
Right. So Naomi Best, she's 26, born and raised in Santa Cruz, California. She did her undergrad at UC Berkeley, legal studies. But her real passion, she said, was helping people. That's what led her to Santa Clara University. It's a Jesuit institution, often seen as combining academics with a kind of spiritual grounding. She enrolled in their counseling psychology master's program. She was actually 2 years in, almost finished, and initially she was quite excited about it all.
And then things took a turn. You mentioned this specific course.
Yeah, her excitement pretty much turned into, well, what she calls a nightmare. It happened when she enrolled in one of her last required courses, human sexuality.
Human sexuality.
Yeah.
Okay, what was so disturbing about it? What did she actually find?
Well, right away, just looking at the syllabus, she hit major red flags. Required readings included things like highly graphic, sadomasochistic, erotica.
Erotica, as in literary fiction or?
No, she gave a specific example, a passage describing, quote, punishing gang sex for a submissive character who'd taken off her collar after a fight with her husband. Really extreme stuff.
Wow, okay, and that wasn't all.
No. There was also what she described as a crassly written pornographic illustration guide, just, detailing various sex acts. And then there's a linked video. It was presented, apparently, under the banner of feminist liberation sexuality. But Naomi said it showed, quote, full frontal exposed women masturbating with one another. Explicit group activity.
And this was required viewing for aspiring therapists at a Jesuit university. I mean, what possible reason could there be? What's the pedagogical justification for that kind of explicit material in professional training? Did they offer one?
According to Naomi, any justifications offered were completely inadequate or just non-existent. It wasn't just the readings either. The final exam, that was a whole other level.
What was the final exam?
It was an 8 to 10 page comprehensive sexual autobiography.
8 to 10 pages. About your own sex life.
Exactly. I mean, the prompts were incredibly intrusive. Discuss when you first started masturbating, chronicle your entire sexual past, your present sexual life, even your, quote, erotic goals for the future.
Okay, that's a lot.
And then you had to explain how all of that personal history would affect your future clinical work.
Was there any way to opt out of certain details?
There was this sort of disclaimer, like a perfunctory disclaimer, saying students didn't have to disclose anything causing extreme discomfort. But Naomi's point was, look, it's 8 to 10 pages. How can you possibly write that much without disclosing something deeply personal if you want to pass? Genuine non-disclosure felt impossible.
And it wasn't just the final paper, right? You mentioned exercises.
Right. The invasiveness started early. In one of the first classes, students were put into co-ed Zoom breakout rooms and asked to discuss their masturbation history.
What? Seriously?
Yeah. That was the point. Naomi just couldn't do it. She exited the Zoom meeting, dropped the course right then, said, nope, I'm not participating in this.
I honestly can't blame her. Were there other exercises like that? Pushing personal boundaries.
Yes. Another one involves students, quote, anonymously writing down something we disliked about our genitals or breasts to be read aloud in class by another student.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. In a class of about 20, only 4 men. She mentioned not knowing how the men felt, but for her, hearing those kinds of intimate dislikes from classmates read aloud, it was just too much, a level of disclosure she wasn't comfortable with.
So after dropping it the first time, she tried to find another way. like an accommodation.
She did. She asked if she could take the course independently. Apparently, she'd heard that some Muslim students had received that kind of accommodation.
Okay, so there was precedent.
Sort of. But here's the catch. She was told that even those Muslim students who got the independent study would still have to submit their comprehensive sexual autobiography.
So the invasive paper was non-negotiable, even for those with accommodations.
Seems like it. And when Naomi requested the same independent study accommodation, citing her Christian faith, she was denied. She was explicitly told she still needed to submit the autobiography to pass the course.
Wow. So a potential double standard there, and absolutely no flexibility on the autobiography. It makes you wonder, okay, maybe therapists need to confront difficult topics, but this level of forced personal disclosure, did the university ever publicly defend why the autobiography was so essential, or why they denied her request?
Not really, not in a way that satisfied Naomi. Their public response later was what she called a non-denial denial. They kind of sidestepped the specifics and, according to her, falsely claimed there was no required sexual disclosure. There wasn't this robust defense of, here's the crucial pedagogical reason for this intensely personal assignment. And here's a key point. This course was required for her graduation, needed for her marriage and family therapist license in California.
Right.
But get this, the state of California does not require a sexual autobiography for licensing, nor does it require consuming erotica or pornography.
So the state requirements and Santa Clara's requirements were totally different.
Exactly. It highlights a pretty big gap between what the licensing board mandates and what this particular university program demanded.
Okay, so despite all that, she felt stuck. She had to take the course to graduate.
Right. She felt she had no other choice. So she re-enrolled, this time with a different professor.
Hoping for a better experience, presumably?
Yes. She said this new professor promised an atmosphere of professionalism and specifically promised no required sexual disclosures. So it sounded promising.
But it didn't turn out that way.
Apparently not. According to Naomi, those promises were, let's say, allegedly broken pretty quickly. She described it as creating a hostile learning environment of a sexual nature.
What happened this time?
She detailed things like how-to bondage video tutorials being played in class.
Seriously? Tutorials?
Yes. One example she gave taught how to tie butterfly knots to restrain a man who was in a gimp suit, either on furniture or on a St. Andrew's cross.
Okay, that's quite specific.
But the final straw, the absolute breaking point for Naomi, was a video described as a sex dungeon tour.
A sex dungeon tour?
Yeah.
In class?
Yeah. It featured an influencer apparently being flogged, electroshocked, wrapped bare in plastic, and ball-gagged. Naomi said the images were so disturbing she started to cry in class. She said, seeing someone be gratified by hurting another person offends how I see the dignity of the human soul.
I can only imagine. How did the professor react after showing something like that?
That's maybe the most chilling part. Naomi recounts that after the video ended, the professor just casually asked the class, so what do you think? Who wants to try it?
Wants to try. The flogging and electroshock.
That's how Naomi interpreted it. And that was it for her. She raised her hand.
What did she say?
She said, this is unacceptable. This is not right. There is one worldview that is acceptable in this room, and I can't do this anymore. Then she got up and walked out.
Good for her for speaking up. Does anyone else react?
On her way out, she shared her email address with her classmates, saying, if anybody has similar concerns, reach out. But she stated that no one did contact her from that specific class section.
Wow. So after walking out a second time, what was the university's response then? Still no accommodation.
Still refused a religious accommodation. They basically told her, you can drop this course or we'll drop you.
So effectively, take it or leave the program.
Pretty much. They did eventually offer her an option to complete the requirement through continuing education courses, but she'd have to pay for those herself out of pocket.
And when she asked for a refund for the course, she couldn't complete.
The department chair apparently responded that her request was astonishing.
Astonishing. Okay. So the focus seems heavily on this graphic sexual content and the forced disclosures. Were there other maybe ideological aspects of the course she found controversial?
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about the explicit stuff. There were other elements. For example, they had a guest speaker described as a male transgender psychologist.
Okay.
This speaker apparently stated that only trans women have push that can blow up the world, and also described being sexually aroused while looking in the mirror.
Okay. What else?
The same psychologist also taught that gender exploratory therapy, which involves discussing the underlying reasons or motivations behind someone's gender dysphoria, is considered malpractice.
Malpraise. Based on what?
Based on what he presented as the American Psychological Association's guidelines. He said these guidelines dictate blanket affirmation of a patient's self-identified gender, even for minors, without that kind of deeper exploration. That exploring why is seen as harmful or not evidence-based.
Right, the affirmation-only model.
Yeah.
That's definitely a point of contention in the field. And what about the instructors themselves? Any issues with boundaries there?
That was a major concern for Naomi, yes. She mentioned the course professor, the second one, openly discussing his personal interest in attending kink festivals.
In class, with students training to be therapists.
Yes. Naomi saw that as a serious violation of boundaries. I mean, here's someone teaching future therapists about maintaining ethical client boundaries while seemingly oversharing his own sexual interests. She made the point that if a therapist disclosed that kind of personal sexual interest to a client, especially unprompted, it could potentially lead to their license being revoked.
That's a really fair point. So with all this, the graphic content, the forced disclosures, the specific takes on gender, the boundary issues, what does Naomi think is the driving force behind it all? Did she research this?
She really did. She dug into it and believes the underlying framework is something called critical theory.
Critical theory.
Yeah.
Okay, can you unpack that a bit? How does she see it applying here?
Sure. So she explains it originated with the Frankfurt School in Germany back in the early 1920s. Its core aim, as she understands it, was to dismantle what it identified as hegemonic power structures. Basically, the idea that anything upholding traditional societal norms was inherently oppressive and needed to be deconstructed.
Deconstructed how?
The strategy, she found, was often to infiltrate academia, culture, even churches, to achieve what they termed human liberation. It often involves co-opting this language of social justice, but changing the definitions of words to effectively dismantle all of these norms.
Okay, I see the connection she's making. How does that relate specifically to the sexuality course content?
Well, within that critical theory framework, normative sexual behavior, traditional views of sex and relationships is seen as just another one of those oppressive forces that needs dismantling. So Naomi came to believe that the course's explicit content and the required sexual disclosures weren't random, they were techniques, a way to inoculate students against traditional norms, to break down the idea of sexual privacy. She actually described it as feeling like a perverse humiliation ritual.
Strong words.
Yeah. She connects it to Marxist Western thought, clarifying she means the theoretical lineage, not necessarily U.S. political parties today. She sees it as fundamentally a left-wing phenomenon in terms of its intellectual origins and goals.
And beyond the theory, what was the actual taught sexual ethic in the program, according to Naomi?
She summarized the ethic taught at Santa Clara as anything between consenting adults goes and should not be met with one judgment or even clinical curiosity.
No judgment. Okay, that sounds vaguely therapeutic, but no clinical curiosity. That seems odd for a therapist.
Exactly. That's the part that really contrasts with traditional views of therapy and Naomi's own perspective. She views sex as, having the potential to bring life into the world, being existentially significant, the most intimate thing you could do with another person physically. But she felt the program treated it super casually, as if it is just another part of the human experience, like eating lunch.
Right.
And that lack of clinical curiosity is key. She argues, look, if a patient reports getting sexual gratification from inflicting pain on another person, shouldn't a therapist be curious? Shouldn't they explore why that association exists, why it's so profound for the patient, rather than just affirming it without question?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Were there other examples of this lack of curiosity?
Yes, she mentioned some really troubling advice they were supposedly given about working with teenage clients. For instance, if a 15-year-old client is engaging in anal sex, the therapist's role, as taught in the program, was simply to instruct her on which lubrication to use.
Just practical advice, no deeper conversation.
And crucially, to co-sign that child's decision not to engage her parents in a conversation. Naomi stressed there was no discussion on how do we talk to teenage clients about what is healthy sexuality, just affirmation and practical tips, devoid of deeper clinical inquiry or guidance on health.
That's concerning. So after all this, facing expulsion, stonewalled at every level, Naomi decides to go public with the Wall Street Journal article. That took guts.
Absolutely. She emphasizes she exhausted every channel in good faith. She went to the professor, the department chair, the dean, the provost, the university president, the Title IX office.
Title IX. Did they investigate the harassment claims?
It seems their response was unsatisfactory to her. She even went to campus ministry. She said a priest there was appalled by her story, but basically just offered prayer.
So no institutional support.
And then the university's public response to the article was, as she put it, that non-denial denial, including, she claims, falsely saying that there was no required sexual disclosure. She genuinely believes the university was gearing up to expel her, not for misconduct, but because her worldview was seen as hostile to the prevailing one in the program.
And the impact of her story going public, has she heard from others?
Yes, significantly. She says she's heard from dozens of students from programs across the country reporting similar experiences.
Like what kind of things?
Things like sex toys and bondage devices actually being brought into the classroom for demonstrations.
Wow. So this isn't necessarily isolated to Santa Clara.
It seems not, based on what she's hearing. Naomi frames this whole pattern as institutionalized sexual harassment and fundamentally abusive. Her big concern now is that we're training future therapists within an ideological framework that overshadows actual clinical skills training. And the risk, she fears, is that these therapists might end up abandoning clients when they need help, or even perpetuating harm because they lack the tools or the perspective for genuine clinical curiosity and intervention.
It's clear this wasn't something she planned. She said she didn't enter school thinking that she would be doing effectively a whistleblower article.
No, she felt she was left with no other choice because the university simply wouldn't engage or address her concerns. It really highlights her resolve.
And what's her goal now? What does she hope comes from this?
Her core belief is simple. Therapists are trained to listen and to understand. That's the job. She wants to continue researching this ideological capture within psychology, push for accountability, and demand an open conversation. Because, as she puts it, denying that conversation puts students at risk, and therefore they're putting clients at risk.
And she had a powerful final point about the field itself, didn't she?
Yes. She said, "We need to demand leadership in psychology to listen and understand everyone in this country because who else is better equipped to do that? A call for the field to live up to its own principles."
So this deep dive really centers on Naomi Best's courageous and frankly quite shocking account. Her stand against what she sees as a deeply problematic, ideologically driven curriculum in a therapy program. It forces us to ask some really tough questions about professional boundaries, ethical training, and where mental health care might be heading.
It really does. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? If the training for those who are supposed to help us heal is grounded in an ethic of, well, anything goes, and actively discourages looking deeper, discourages clinical curiosity about difficult behaviors, what does that ultimately mean for how we even define mental health in our society, especially for the most vulnerable people who are seeking help? What questions does this raise for you, listening right now, about where knowledge comes from in these fields, how it's applied, especially when it touches the most intimate, most sensitive parts of our lives?